Hi everybody, I'm Stuart Hillard and welcome to my latest quilting classroom with Create and Craft and Accuquilt. Now, one of my favourite techniques for using in my quilt making and home decor is applique. Or is it applique? Well, it doesn't matter how you say it, but the way you do it can really make the difference between a project which you're proud of and love and one which drains the joy out of your craft. Now, with Accuquilt, you can cut all of your applique shapes so quick, so easily, and so perfectly every single time. It just makes adding applique to your projects a complete joy. Now, in this season's Create and Craft Club magazine, I've included a bonus project for you, and I'm going to show you some of the processes for how I made that project on the classroom today. The project in your Create and Craft Club magazine is for this lovely garden pillow. And this uses the tumbler die and the flower die that you will get included with your Go Baby. Now, if you don't have either of those two dies, you can certainly substitute some of the other dies. Adita Sitar Simple Shapes, any of the flower dies, the round flower would look great. I've also used some elements from the owl die, and you might not see that immediately, but when we get to that section of the applique, you'll see how that owl die comes in so very handy. So let's make a start and gather together all of the supplies that we need for doing applique with our Accuquilt. Now, the first thing that we need are a few basics. Obviously, you're going to need some fabric to use for your project. Now, I like to use 100% quilt weight cotton, but your Accuquilt dies will also cut felt, thin leather, oilcloth, home decor fabrics, really any kind of fabric at all. So if you want to substitute some different fabrics for the ones I've used, go ahead and do that. Just keep in mind, if your project is going to be washed, just make sure that all of the fabrics that you use can be washed together. So I've got my quilt weight cotton fabrics right here. Another supply that you're going to need is some paper-backed Fusible Web. Now, there are all sorts of different brands and different varieties. I like to use Flysofix. They all pretty much do the same job. You have got a paper backing, and then you've got a thin coating of glue on the surface, and it's sprayed on and then dried. And this is heat activated. It's very easy to use. It gives great results, very durable results, and works perfectly well with your Accuquilt dies. So we've got our fabric, we've got our paper-backed Fusible Web. You're also going to need some scissors, some for fabric, some for paper. Don't mix up the two. I once got into terrible trouble with my mum for using her pinking shears on paper. Never did that again. You also need your iron and an ironing surface, but most importantly, you need your Accuquilt cutter and your dies. Now, I've designed this project in particular to use any of the machines. So all of the dies that I've used will go through the Go Baby, the Go, or the Go Big. So I have used the flower. This comes with your Go Baby. I've also used the tumbler die. Now, typically we'd use this tumbler die as a piecing die. It's got your 1/4 inch seam allowance added on all round. It's got the dog ears clipped off. But as soon as I saw this die, I couldn't help but see a flower pot as well. And it really was the basis of my inspiration for this project. So when you're looking at your dies, try and see beyond the basics. Okay, I've also got here the Adita Sitar Simple Shapes die, which if you don't have either of those dies, you could use this die for the flowers, the petals, the leaves. You could even add some stems in there as well. So you can really mix and match this depending on what dies you've got. Okay, so let's get to first steps. So So I've got my selection of fabrics here, and I've just roughly cut out some pieces of fabric. They're a little bigger than I need. They're just rough squares or rectangles of fabric. And I've used my fabric scissors to cut these out. I've also got some pieces of paper-backed fusible web. And when you look at your fusible web, there are two very distinct sides. There's the paper side, and that will feel completely smooth. The other side of your fusible web may glint or glitter a little bit. That's a good sign. That helps you to identify where the glue is. It'll also feel slightly rough and raised, so if you run your fingers over the surface of your fusible web, that will also give you an indication which is the fusible side, the glue side, and which is the paper side. Now that's super important, particularly if you want to look after your iron and your ironing board and you don't want to get glue on them. So what we're going to do next is we're going to fuse some pieces of our web to our fabric. So let's start off with the green that I'm using for the leaves. What I'm going to do first of all, you can see the fabric's got a right side, a pretty side, and a wrong side. So we're interested right now in the wrong side, okay? So we're going to put that face down on our table. And then I'm going to cut a piece of fusible web that's a little bit smaller than the fabric. And I'm just using my paper scissors for this. Fusible web tends to curl up as you're using it. Now, if there's any overhang, you want to make sure that you snip that off before you try fusing it, because that's one of those bits that could get stuck to your iron or ironing board, and we really don't want that to happen. So once you've cut out your fusible web and your fabric, what you want to do is put the glue side of your fusible web onto the wrong side of your fabric. So we've got the paper side facing uppermost. Pop that down on your ironing surface, and then we're going to fuse the layers together. Now, if you're using quilt weight cotton, then you can use your iron on a cotton setting. If you were using fusible web with something like wool or acrylic felt, then you would want to use just a one spot, a wool setting. It might take a little bit longer to fuse the web to your fabric because the temperature's not so high. So just take your time. And what you want to do is maintain that heat for probably, with quilt weight cotton, 4 or 5 seconds. You'll know when it's all fused down. You can always at this stage flip it over and give it a little smooth from the front as well. And it's a nice smooth gliding action when you're fusing that web to the back of your fabric. Now, some people, when they're using fusible web, like to put a piece of greaseproof paper down on their ironing board first, and you can also put another piece of greaseproof paper over the top of your fabrics before you set your iron on top, and that's just to protect your iron and your ironing board from any glue. But if you're careful and you make sure that your fusible web's glue side down, paper side up, and it's smaller than your fabric, you shouldn't have any problems. But belt and braces, you can always cover the surface with some greaseproof. Now, the important thing when you've done that fusing is to leave that to cool, okay? We can't start peeling off paper back or anything like that while the fusible is still hot. Okay, so that gives us a chance just to prepare our other pieces of fabric and web. So exactly the same process. Glue side down, paper side up, and then just glide the iron back and forth over the surface. You can always flip the fabric over and then leave it to one side so it can get cool. Now, you'll probably need somewhere in the region of 1/4 meter of fusible web for this project. So you don't need a lot of fusible web. You tend to buy it by the meter. And one little tip for you is don't buy masses of fusible web at any one time unless you're planning on using all of it, because it's not a product that stores very well. What you'll find after quite a short amount of time, particularly depending on the temperature, is that the fusible, the glue, can start to lift off the paper back and it separates out. So you end up with this sort of filmy, gauzy, gluey layer and a piece of paper. And then it's not very easy to use at all. So I'm almost done. That's all of my fabrics fused for my flowers, my leaves and my centers. I just need one more piece of fusible web for my flower pot. So again, use your paper scissors to cut out your web. Using plain fabrics is a great strategy, you know, because they don't really have a right side and a wrong side, so it doesn't matter which side you fuse your web to. I like to use the wrong side of my fabrics too sometimes. If I want a paler version of the main fabric, I'll use the wrong side. So that's another little tip for you. Okay, so all of my fabrics now are fused and they're cooling down. So I can clear my decks a little bit and get the all-important Accuquilt cutter out ready. So for today's demonstration, I'm using my Go cutter. But as I mentioned, your Go Baby, your Go Big will all work for this too. The dies are compatible with all of those machines. Now, one of the things that I always hated about doing Fusible Applique was all of that tracing out of shapes and then cutting out roughly with scissors and then fusing and then having to cut out every single individual shape with a pair of scissors. It's so laborious, it's so time consuming, and the results are really not so great. If your hand wobbles, the shape can get spoiled. With my Accuquilt dies, I know that everything's going to be beautifully accurate every single time. So let's start off by cutting some flowers. So I've got my flower die first of all. Now I want a couple of those. Now normally with our Accuquilt dies, we can cut up to 6 layers of fabric in one pass. Usually 4 layers at a time if we're cutting with the Go Baby. Now, when you've added fusible web to fabric, I want you to think of that fusible web as half a layer. So this means 1.5 layers. So this is 3 layers. So I can do up to 4 layers of fused fabric. I need 2 flowers, so 2 layers is good. So I'm going to lay that fabric on top of my flower die, just making sure that the flower shape is completely covered. And remember, all our dies have 2-tone foam, so you can see exactly where the shape is that you want to cut. So lay your fabric on top, and in this instance, it doesn't matter whether the fusible web is up or down. Doesn't make any difference. With some of your dies where there's a line of symmetry, then it does matter, okay? And it depends which die you're cutting. So last of all, put your cutting mat on top. This is a 6x6 cutting mat, and then we can run it through the machine. 1 pass is enough. Out the other side, slide your mat off, and remove your excess fabric. I mean, how easy was that? So if we had to cut 150 of these flower shapes out for a whole quilt, it's going to take us a matter of minutes, and we know that they're going to be perfect every single time. So I've got my flowers cut. Next thing, I can cut out my flower pot. So I'm going to use my brown for the flower pot. Just need 1 of those. And again, cutting mat on top. When I'm putting my cutting mat on top of my die, I like to turn my mat each time I use it, and I also like to flip it over. That spreads out the wear and tear on your cutting mat, means that your cutting mat is going to last as long as possible. Remember, your cutting mat's the only thing that's ever going to wear out on your system. So I have my flower pot. Next up, I need to cut some leaf shapes. Now, for this version, I'm going to use the Adidas Sitar Simple Shapes. This is one of my favorite applique dies that Accuquilt do, because there's so much on this die to inspire me. We've got 3 different sizes of circle. We've got 4 different leaf shapes. We've also got a bud. We've got a lovely long stem, and of course you can trim that down if you want shorter stems. We've even got a bird. So, hey, you might even want to add a bird to your applique this time. So I want to cut some leaves, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold my fabric up so that I can fit that over the top of two of the leaf shapes. And remember, if you only want to cut the leaves, they're the only bit that you have to cut with fabric. You don't have to cover the whole die. Now, if you're using the Adidas Tatar Simple Shapes die, you will need the 6x12 cutting mat, but this will still go through your Go Baby. So one pass to cut our leaves. So we've got 2 large leaves and 2 smaller leaves. And don't forget, when you open out your piece of fabric that's left over, you could always get another leaf in the sort of in-between space as well if you needed it. Another thing you could do with that little in-between space, I'm just going to give it a little press to get rid of the crease, is you could cut a short stem. And I think for a bit of variety on this particular project, I'm going to put a little bit of stem as well, a little bit of stemmage. So there we go, that truly is no waste. All right, so we've got our leaves, we've got a little stem, we've got our flowers and our flower pot. The last thing that we need to cut out is the flower centers. I'm going a little bit non-traditional with this and using some green fabric. On my Simple Shapes, I've got 3 different sizes of circle. I'm going to use the largest circle for this. I think I should just be able to squeeze that on. We don't like wasting fabric, do we? So we like to squeeze out every little bit we can. I love the fact with my Accuquilt system, I don't have to concentrate on what I'm doing when I'm cutting out. I too well remember the days of rotary cutting where I had to have complete silence and no TV and no music and certainly no talking. I think it would have made my job here very difficult if I had to concentrate. Perish the thought, eh? So that's all the elements cut out in a matter of a few minutes. I mean, how easy is that? So my Accuquilt can go away, and I can get my background square out ready and start playing around with placement. Now, in the pattern, you're going to need to cut out a 9.5-inch square. Now, we do a 10-inch square, that's the Go Big square, but that will only go through your Go Big. So this might be an element that you need to rotary cut. But, you know, rotary cutting is not a dirty word. We are still allowed to do it sometimes, but only if you have to. And then what we're going to do is just play around with those shapes and see where we like to place them. I've still got the paper backing on all of my shapes. I don't want to remove that yet. I'm going to slide the stem underneath. That just raises that one flower up a little bit. And then I think it always looks nice if you can sort of overlap and underlap some of your shapes. Makes them look a bit more naturalistic. So that the leaves actually look like they're growing out of the flower stem. So maybe something like that. And don't forget your flower centers as well. So once you've had a little play and you're happy with the placement, there's one little check I want you to do. I'm going to just grab a rotary ruler. And what you want to make sure that you do here is that for a start off, your flower pot base is straight and level, okay? Unless you don't want it to be. If you don't want it to be, then leave out this section. But I like to just place a rotary ruler along the bottom, and then I can actually butt the flower pot up against the ruler. It's a nice stable base. So I've put that about 7/8 of an inch up from the bottom. The other thing that you want to check is that you've got a minimum 1/4 of an inch space all the way around. Now actually, for safety's sake, I like about 1/2 inch all round. So I'm just going to drop my ruler on top of my applique background just to make sure that I've got at least 1/2 inch or 1/4 of an inch all the way around. And I do. Now, one last step before you start removing all the pieces. If you've got a phone that has a camera on it, take a couple of quick pictures. If you've got a digital camera, something like that, take a couple of pictures, because it's very easy to forget what went where. And if you've absolutely got your heart set on one particular way of arranging your petals and flowers, you don't want to forget. So once you've done that, you can remove the shapes, and then we need to remove the paper from the back before we can fuse the shapes down. Now, what I don't want you to do, what a lot of us try to, is to start flicking with our thumbs to try and get the edge of the paper up, okay? It could take you a very long time to get the edges of the paper up, because remember, they are fused down. But also, all the time you're flicking with your thumb, you're distorting the edge of your fabric, and you will end up with a buckled edge to your appliques. So rather than doing that, grab a straight pin. And then what you're going to do is you're going to scratch an X on the back of the paper. Okay, once you've done that, you should very easily be able to tear that paper away from the center outwards. And can you see how doing that doesn't disturb the edges, doesn't distort them, doesn't affect them at all? And now we've got our perfect shape. The edges are all still perfect and smooth and straight, and we did it easily. So we're just going to do that with all of the shapes now. Just a little score line in the back. This is where it's good to have an assistant. I'm just hinting. No one wants to be my assistant. So just keep scratching through the back, and then just peel away all of your paperback fusible. This is always the stage where I say make sure that no one is around you who has a cold, because any kind of achoo and all of your bits are going to fly everywhere. So peel all the paper back off. It's not a bad idea to have a little rubbish bin handy next to you, or you can just be like me and throw it on the floor. Just do a tidy up at the end. I find it very difficult to be creative and tidy at the same time. I'm a typical man like that. I cannot multitask. Not to that extent, anyway. So we're almost there. I just need to do my leaves and stems. So again, now you might not be able to get a full X, but just a scratch down the center of your leaves just to help you remove the paper. There we go. A couple more to go. Now, some Fusible Web doesn't have a paper back, so you might use something like Misty Fuse, which is literally just a gauzy web. You lay that on the back of the fabric, lay something like a Teflon sheet or greaseproof paper over the back, iron it, and then there's no paper to remove. So that's quite a nice option as well. Misty Fuse has many, many fans. Okay, there we go. So that's all of the elements ready to fuse down now. So, refer back to that photograph. I'll pop my ruler back down just to make sure everything's nice and straight and level. And then we'll just go back to more or less that original plan. I don't mind if they're in slightly different positions. I think this is one of the ways that any of us can be a quilt designer, because we can cut out our shapes, we can play with them, and then if we come up with a design that we love, we can just fuse it down, and there you go. You've designed your own quilt block. We don't need to always buy other people's designs. And that's one of the things that's so liberating about using your Accuquilt dies, because the pieces are so easy to cut out. Why wouldn't you have a play? It's only taken a few minutes to cut out those pieces. Now, one of the things I like to do when I'm placing my flower centers, the natural reaction, I think, or the natural response, is to place your flower center sort of smack bang in the middle, which looks lovely, a little bit orla, but I actually like to move it over a little bit. I like to think of it as like, you know, the yolk on a fried egg that's never quite in the center. It just looks a bit more naturalistic, looks a bit more quirky, and it helps to make the flower look like it's slightly turned or slightly, you know, away from the viewer. Just adds a little bit more of a naturalistic look to your flowers themselves. So once you've got all those elements placed and you're happy with them, it's time to fuse. So very carefully slide your quilt block onto your pressing surface. Or if you've got a nice big pressing surface on your table, you could actually do the whole thing on that pressing surface. Now this is where we've got to press, not iron, okay? So I know when I'm doing my jeans, I'm back and forth. But for a job like this, you literally just want to press. I always think back now to when I was at school doing textiles with my teacher, and everything she taught us was right. We didn't think so at the time, but it really is quite a good idea to pin, baste, and then sew. And she always talked to us about pressing rather than ironing. And it doesn't take long before your pieces are fused in place and you have your flowers in a pot, all fused down, ready to sew. Now, you can just attach them very lightly to begin with, check that the placement's good, and if you're really not happy, you can probably disentangle them and have another go. But if you're all happy with that, I do like to just give it a quick press from the back as well, just to make sure that everything is really well fused. And then we can get to the sewing. So I've got all my appliques ironed down onto my background fabric, and now I'm ready to stitch them down. Now there are various different options for sewing your appliques to your main fabric, and one of the considerations is how your piece of work is going to be used. If you're going to wash it a lot, so if it's going to be used for, say, something like a baby quilt, a bed quilt, then you want to finish the edges in quite a robust way, and I will talk you through what I mean by that in just a second. If you're going to use your applique piece as maybe just an embellishment, a cushion, a wall hanging, something like that, that isn't going to get a lot of wear and tear, then your edge stitching can be more decorative. You can do them on your machine. Of course, you can, if you want to, hand sew your appliques. Something like a hand blanket stitch looks lovely, but most sewing machines are also equipped with a blanket stitch on them, so you can do it on the machine as well, and it looks really professional. It's very even. It's much quicker, of course, to do it by machine as well, and most of the time when I'm making projects, time is a consideration. So let's have a little look at what we need for those various different options and the kind of effect you're going to get. Now, I mean, first of all, on my cushion here, I've used very much a raw edge applique technique. So if you have a nice close look at this, you'll see that once the appliques were stitched down, I've used a straight stitch and I've sewn very close, probably an 1/8 of an inch, a few millimeters away from the edge, all the way around, and I'll be showing you how I did that. But it's also a very, very nice finish to use a blanket stitch. Now this is a fun project. This is using the Accuquilt cupcake die. How adorable is that? And calorie free. I can guarantee that, calorie free. Now on this piece of work, I've used a blanket stitch, and rather than changing the colour ever such a lot, I've just used a neutral cream tan shade and appliqued around all of the edges, and a blanket stitch is a really nice finish too. So that's what I've used for that. And then I've got a lovely Christmas quilt here that I want to show you, which uses some more decorative stitches. Now I'll just throw this open so that you can get a really good look at it. And you can see there on the Christmas trees and the snowflakes, we've used a decorative embroidery stitch. So there are all kinds of stitches on your machine, almost certainly, that you could have a play at using. But have a look also on the holly leaves, and you'll see some of the holly leaf blocks right near the centre. And there we've used what's called a satin stitch, which is quite a heavy edging, but it looks fabulous, doesn't it? Really, really lovely finish, and you really see that stitching. So I suppose when you're thinking about how you're going to finish the edges of your applique, you need to think first of all, how's the finished piece going to be used? Is it going to require washing? Is it going to get a lot of wear and tear? If it does, then you need a nice robust edging, like a blanket stitch. A small zigzag is also good, and every machine does a zigzag, or you know, maybe a blanket stitch or satin stitch. If the piece isn't going to get so much wear and tear, it's more decorative, then you can use things like a straight stitch, or you can use some of the decorative stitches on your sewing machine. So however you finish the edges of your appliques, make sure it's appropriate for the finished product. Now, when you come to do your sewing, you probably want to change the foot on your sewing machine. Normally, my 1/4 inch foot lives on my machine. When I'm doing my applique, I tend to change it. So that foot comes off. The foot that I most often use is this one, which is an open-toed embroidery foot. Now, mine is metal, yours might be plastic, but it'll have the same basic features. It is an open toe, so in other words, it is open right at the front, which gives you a really clear view of the needle and also the edge of the fabric that you're stitching down. The other thing that's really important about your open-toed embroidery foot is that on the back of the foot there is a groove cut away that will travel over the surface of your stitching. Lots of decorative stitches, particularly things like satin stitches, are quite raised, quite bulky. This cutaway means that your foot will travel smoothly over the top of them. So if you haven't got an open-toed embroidery foot for your machine, it's well worth looking into getting one. So that's one of my favorites, and I'm going to install that now. Another foot that I use a lot when I'm doing applique is my darning foot. So this is my darning foot, and again, this is an open-toed version. Yours might be a closed toe, so it's a full circle. Mine has a little opening, which again gives me a better view of the edge of the fabric and also the needle. And I will use this for free motion stitching around my appliques. So let me start by showing you how you'd use the open-toed embroidery foot to do various different finishes on your appliques. Now we can use a zigzag, we can use a blanket stitch, we can use a satin stitch. But if we're going to use particularly a satin stitch or a heavy zigzag, we do need to use some of this stuff on the back of our fabric. And this is tearaway stabilizer. It looks very much like interfacing, non-woven interfacing. It looks almost like paper. But what this does is it makes the fabric sort of firmer and more robust. because when we're doing something like heavy satin stitching, it can really make the fabric buckle and distort, and our appliques as well if we're not careful. This will stop that happening. So what we would do is we would cut a piece just bigger than your applique, just a little bit bigger, a square or a rectangle, and then pin it to your fabric. Okay, you could also use a spray adhesive if you wanted to. Make sure it's one that's fabric safe, but I'm just going to use a couple of straight pins just to hold that interfacing in place. And I'm just showing you on a plain piece of fabric here how the stitches would appear, but you would do this behind your applique. And what that's going to do is make everything more stable, more robust. So let's start off with a zigzag stitch, and I'm going to stitch that out. Now the normal setting for your zigzag is really a construction zigzag. It's not that suitable for applique. It's a bit wide and it's a bit too open. So you're going to want to adjust the width and the length of your stitch as well. Now adjusting the width is going to make the distance between the zig and the zag smaller. So it's going to make it narrower and neater. You might want it wide, but for most applications you want a fairly narrow zigzag stitch. So we're going to reduce the width of the zigzag, and then I'm also going to reduce the length of the zigzag. Now the length of the zigzag will reduce the distance between each of those zigzags and compress everything together. Okay, and the more you do that, the more like a satin stitch you're going to get. Okay, so I'm just reducing that down. Now at about a width of one and a length of one, you're going to get quite a nice, neat zigzag stitch. If I take that down further and take the length down to about half, you're going to get more of a satin stitch, and I'll show you how that looks. And you might even go a little more than that, just to really, really reduce it down. So I'll just clip off my threads. And what you can see here is the difference between the normal zigzag and the reduced zigzag, and then over here we've got the satin stitch. Okay. And my favourite way to do applique is to free motion stitch around it. So that's what I'm going to show you next. That's where I use my darning foot. And this is actually a technique you can use to applique and quilt at the same time. Now, I love getting 2 for 1. If I can do 2 jobs at the same time, I am a happy man. So I'm installing my darning foot, first of all. So my darning foot is on. And that's going to allow me to free motion stitch. In other words, stitch in any direction. I've got one colour in the top. Now I'm using a cream here because I quite like the look of that, and also I want you to be able to see where I'm stitching. You'll notice with my applique, I've actually attached it to a piece of quilt batting. Now I've just used a spray basting glue to hold that on. You could pin it on instead. If you were going to make my cushion, you'd want to add the borders before you start doing this applique quilting. But I'm just making a small sample here to show you how the process works. So I've just got the centre 10-inch square fused down, and I've got my batting on the back. Okay, so I've got my machine set to a straight stitch. I haven't changed the stitch length or the stitch width or anything like that. I'm just going to keep it on the default setting, but what I am going to do is drop the feed dogs. Now the feed dogs are those little teeth underneath the presser foot that carry the fabric through. I've disengaged them when I drop them. I've disengaged them so they're not going to carry the fabric through anymore. They're not going to dictate the direction of the fabric. I can move my fabric any which way I want to, which is so liberating. Once you've done it, you'll be hooked, I promise you. Now I'm going to start off by appliquing down the flowers. And so I'm going to start up here in the top corner, and I'm going to drop the needle into my fabric and then bring the needle back up again. I'm going to pull upwards on my top thread so that I've now got the bobbin thread on the top of my work. I want both threads there so they don't get into a tangle, and then I'm just going to drop the needle back down into my work. So we're sewing around the appliques now, and I'm free motion stitching. I've got my darning foot attached and I've already made a start. So what I'm doing here is I'm just guiding the fabric through my machine, and I am just taking a stitch it's just about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge of the applique. So it's quite a nice casual way of appliquing. And if you use a thread which is quite sympathetic, like a cream, it doesn't matter if you go around a couple of times. So that's actually what I'm going to do. I'm going to go around this flower a second time now to add a second line of stitching. Now when I get up to the leaf, rather than going past it, I'm actually going to go around the leaf and applique that in place. Now while we're there doing the leaf, it seems a shame not to put a little vein into the leaf, so I'm going to stitch out into the center and back and just stitch a few veins into my leaf while I'm there, all free motion, and then continue around the flower. I'm at the next leaf now, so let's go around the leaf, and again we're just trying to stick about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. And then we'll go in and put a little bit of a vein into the leaf. And this is a great way of adding some embellishment and some quilting to your finished piece. Continue around the flower. And then when you get up to the top of the flower, we can actually go straight on to flower number 2 and do the same process, stitching around that flower. Now, if your free motion skills require a little bit of practice, this is a great way of doing it. Because rather than doing something that's, terribly neat and terribly precise, you can do something that's a little bit more casual, something that's a little bit more free and easy, something that doesn't matter quite so much. I always tell my students, nobody got better at something by avoiding doing it. So if you want to get better at your free motion quilting and your free motion embroidery, have a go at making this project and stitch your appliques down free motion style. The amazing thing is, I've only been doing this for a couple of minutes and I've nearly finished. Can you believe that? So that's the flowers done now. Now I'm going to finish off the thread there and clip, but I'm just going to clip my threads on the top. I'm going to leave the bobbin thread attached. I'm going to go across to my flower center, and then I'm going to stitch around the flower center. Now I want to add a little bit of extra embellishment in that flower center. So once I've stitched around the outside edge, I'm going to keep spiraling inwards towards the center. Now take your time. Don't focus on the center of that flower center. Just focus on the line that you're stitching. And then finish off your thread in the middle. I'll show you how that looks. I think it's a really fun finish. What do you think of that flower center? So I'm going to carry on doing the other one now. We're nearly done. Why wouldn't you give this a go? So we'll do the other flower center. You'll have noticed as well that I had to add a little bow to my flower pot. That die actually came from the holiday accessories. So that would work really well put on a square to make a gift or a present. But I thought it was also a great embellishment for this pot of flowers. If you wanted to make a gift for Mother's Day, wouldn't this cushion make a great gift? Flowers for Mum. So the last thing I need to do is go around the bow. So again, I'm just going to start my thread off in the center and stitch around the bow. The bow actually would look lovely done in wool felt. And wool felt, of course, won't fray. So it doesn't matter how close or not close to the edge you stitch. It's always going to look neat and tidy, which is a really nice finish. And actually, if you only stitched in the very center of the bow would actually sort of sit proud of your project. Now, when I get to the center of my bow, I want to just emphasize the knot in the center. So I'm going to do that with stitching and just stitch round a couple of times. And I'm also going to stitch some sort of crease lines out into the bow itself. Doing these little added details can really bring your appliques to life. And it's ever so easy and it doesn't take long. There we go. The last thing that's left to do now is just to stitch around the flower pot itself. Now you could change the colour of your thread here, but in for a penny, in for a pound, I'm going to stitch around the pot using my white thread. And where I need to travel, I'm just going to travel on the appliques. It's a nice, easy technique. And remember, this is casual applique, so it doesn't matter if you wobble a little bit. That generally means that I've wobbled, if I say that. But really, I love this effect. I think it looks so cute. And then if you want to, you could go around a second time. But I think once around the pot is quite enough. And then all that's left to do is any loose threads that are still on the surface, you can just trim them away. Now, last step is just to trim your excess batting away from the edge. And I'm just going to use my fabric scissors to do that. Just do it roughly here. You could use a rotary cutter for this step. And then what we're left with is a beautifully appliqued and quilted, all in one step, little panel that you could make up into a cushion, or you could even put some backing fabric on that before you quilted it and then bind it, and you could use it as a mini quilt. And there's my finished little project. Really beautiful applique, all done using your Accuquilt system, because we know that better cuts make better quilts. Now, while we're still talking about applique, I just wanted to share a couple of my top tips for you for applique. One of the bugbears of quilters, I think, is curved piecing. Lots of us like the look of it, and we're a bit intimidated by the idea of piecing curves. So we want to make something like a drunkard's path quilt, but we really can't face all that curved piecing. So why not applique it instead? Take a look at this quilt that's hanging behind me, which uses half circles. Now, when you look at the quilt itself, it looks like curved piecing, but there isn't a single bit of curved piecing in it. It's all appliqued. What I used for that was this fabulous die, which is the 8-inch circle. I used the 8-inch circle. I used exactly the same applique method that I've shown you today. Fusible web on the back of the fabric, iron it down, then cut out full circles. What I did then was peeled the paper backing away, fused those circles onto squares. My squares were 10-inch cut. Then I made sure my circles were centered. And you can do that easily just by folding your square and folding your circle into quarters and then line up those creases. So iron your circle in the center and then applique the edge. Use something like a zigzag or a blanket stitch. Once it's appliqued, use your rotary cutter, ruler and mat to cut your piece either into halves, which I've used for this quilt, or into quarters to create the look of a drunkard's path quilt, but no curved piecing at all. It's so easy. You could do a quilt this weekend. While we're also talking about applique, I've got to show you two fabulous new dies, which haven't been seen yet. We've got the fabulous Northwoods appliques, which has a really cute mousse. Not a chocolate mousse, not a strawberry mousse, but a real mousse. A tree, a pine tree, and also a bear. And you know I love a bear. And then we've also got the fabulous musical medley. I desperately want to say melody there. We've got the treble clef, and then we've got the other musical notes there. So if you know somebody who enjoys music, what a great way to bring applique to a project for them. Don't forget, better cuts make better quilts.